Hello, everybody. Welcome to Interacting with Sensors. This is part one of a two-part webinar talking about sensors with UB Tech Education. So great. Let's go ahead and we'll just get started. Great. So first and foremost, if this is your first webinar, which it looks like a lot of you guys, it is not, which is awesome to see some familiar names there. As always, remember, we want you guys to connect with us. So here are all of our social handles. You can see us. We are on Facebook, Twitter, or X. We are on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. So find us. All of our handles are UB Tech EDU or UB Tech Education on YouTube. And then, of course, visit our website, ubtecheducation.com. You can find all relevant information. And then you guys can always email us if you'd like. I'll also jump to our next screen, introducing ourselves. If you guys don't know us already, my name is Rusty and I am the EDU product manager. You can see my email directly on the screen. Please send me a note, say hi, or you can find me on LinkedIn as well. There's my handle. I'll toss it over to Kristina.
My name is Kristina Davis. We need to update my title there. Curriculum manager. Here at UB Tech. All my contact info is on the screen, so feel free to reach out. I'm going to kind of hang back in this webinar, so I'm managing the Q&A and the chat. So if you have questions, if you want to just put stuff in the chat, if you want to raise your hand, I will be looking for all of that stuff and we'll be asking Rusty and our guest speaker all those questions. We will answer questions throughout. We will also answer questions at the end, so feel free to send in whatever you would like. But just so you know, I'm here, but I'm going to shut off my screen while the rest of the guys are talking. So back to you, Rusty.
Great, thank you. Great, and I am I'm presenting to you guys from our product room as well. So if you'll see, we have an assortment of UKITs, all parts and pieces, all behind me. This is also my secondary office and where I get some privacy from the chaotic robot development office. So our agenda today is pretty simple. So we are going to look at the UKIT sensors. These sensors that we utilize with our UKIT robots, what we have access to. Just note, since it is part one of a two-part series, we are going to just touch on the basic sensors that we have access to. And then we are going to hear from one of our awesome teachers, one of our teacher ambassadors, who has been utilizing all the sensors that we'll touch on in the classroom with teachers, or with students, I should say. He is the teacher. So he will be a great contact for you guys if you have any questions on how to integrate these type of interactions with students in the classroom. He has a ton of resources, so we're really happy that he is joining us today. And also to note, it looks like we may not have him on camera, but he is here, so just keep your ears open. We'll try to turn the volume up. Before we get started and touch on our sensors, as always, we want to introduce you to kind of our overarching message of who we are as a company. We are UB Tech Education. We are a North American specific division of UB Tech Robotics, where we specialize in creating robotic solutions specifically designed for the classroom. So we have a variety of STEM kits and curriculum that are all high quality, high level, meant for you guys to integrate and teach some of those 21st century skills to students. So let's dive in directly and look at how we can leverage some of our products to teach and impact students. So first and foremost, we're currently offering 3 different levels of kits: our UKIT Beginner, our UKIT Intermediate, and our UKIT Advanced. Our UKIT Beginner, which you'll see is not featured on this slide because it does not contain sensors. That UKIT Beginner kit is intended for students to develop comfort moving robots. So basically get comfort with the dynamics of and the fundamentals of robotic movements. However, we jump into the intermediate by adding on a variety of input and output components or sensors, and then the advanced kind of jumps and adds all of those sensors and a ton more as well. So we are going to touch on some of the sensors from the UKIT Advanced, but please come back next month where we're going to focus a little bit more in depth on the UKIT Advanced. So just to highlight what we have access to, what we work with our tools here, we have a very high quality IR sensor or infrared sensor, which is my favorite sensor, what I always lead with when I talk about our sensors, because this is how you can really interact with your environment. This is a great sensor for reading distance and a robot is from an object. So that means it translates very well to your vehicle robots or any robot that you want to directly interact with. We also utilize pressure sensors or touch sensors. So these interact like a button in that you apply pressure to the surface of the sensor, and it does interact with the system by detecting the amount of pressure or the kind of pressure you're applying to the system. So all of our touch sensors interact in 3 different stages: a single tap, so just a press; a double tap, which like it sounds, pressing it twice; or a long hold. In addition, we also interact with an ultrasonic sensor, which is similar to an IR sensor, meaning that it's really utilized to detect how far objects are from your particular source or your robot. However, this one doesn't use infrared light like the IR sensor. This actually utilizes ultrasonic sound waves. So for that, you do get kind of a different reading and a different way to interact with your sensor or interact with your robot. And it does offer a little bit more distance than your IR sensor. In addition, we also offer RGB LED lights. These aren't your typical input sensors. These are output components, meaning they are giving information out into the world, not taking information in. However, they're really fun to work with, and they add a lot of personality to your robots. So we always like to mention them. And then lastly, the last sensor that I'll touch on is our most complex looking sensor. This is our grayscale sensor or a line following sensor, if you're familiar with other types of robotics. So this particular sensor interacts like an Arduino Nano, meaning you can interact with it with the Arduino IDE. It does have 5 individual light and dark detecting sensors. So these sensors work by detecting basically a light or dark surface and interpreting that through the course of 5 position different sensors. Brian, who's joining us, has some really great interactions with that sensor. So excited to see what he's done with that. So when we talk about sensors, how do we kind of introduce this topic? Because this is kind of your next stage of robotics. So we've developed something, we've been able to program it, make it move, respond to our code, respond to our programs. But the next level would be being able to give information into our system. And that's where your sensor, acts as what we like to say, acts as a window that's able to collect information. So you can think of a sensor as just an open window that's just waiting for a particular type of information to go into that window, into your system, for your system to interact and decode that information. So the sensor itself, in particular, is looking and able to interpret very specific types of information. So, for example, your IR sensor is only looking for infrared light, while your pressure sensor is only looking for pressure applied to the surface of that particular component. So these are kind of your next level phases of looking at how you can interact with robotics. However, this information, I always like to relay this to students that, sensors actually don't do anything. They are just these blanket open windows ready to collect information. We have to interpret all of that information and program how we're going to interact with that information. So, sometimes students can get hung up, say my IR sensor is the one that's detecting, and is telling my system, where something is. So that, theoretically, could be interpreted as true, but it's not necessarily, or it's not true. It's just giving information to your system. The system, the way that you're processing that information is what's giving you the reading and telling you how far that object is. So Something I like for students to kind of, incorporate. And you can think about and relay that the same way to, say, a person who's able to, smell a bad smell using their nose sensor. Their nose is just giving that information to the system, your body. Your brain is the one that's actually interpreting all of that information. Kind of a cool, in my opinion, take on looking at robotics. So let's look at an example. So what are we talking about in terms of giving information into a system? In particular, focusing on the IR sensor, which is, in my opinion, a great gateway or springboard into understanding working with sensors. This is featured in our intermediate and advanced kit because it's really easy to understand. It's really easy to use, though it has a lot of complexity and a lot of scalability with it. So how does this actually work? So if you'll actually look at the surface, or the face, I should say, of that component, you'll see there's two different lenses. There's a light one and a dark one. So one of the lenses is emitting, sending out an infrared light. So that infrared light we personally cannot see, but it's moving out, and it's waiting for it to touch an object. It's near its object, and then refract or reflect off of that object and return to the other lens. So you have one emitting lens and then one receiving lens. And so the receiving lens is basically able to take that input, that information, and it's going to calculate and assign a value to how far or how long it took for that signal to come back. Then it does a quick calculation and puts that value out into a readable distance. So our IR sensors actually work by expressing a value of 0 to 20 centimeters. So if you don't really know how far that distance is, if you put your hands together just like this, from one pinky to another pinky is approximately 20 centimeters. So it's not a huge distance that it's going to read, but it does work really well, especially if you're working with those vehicle robots. Say you want to have a vehicle that if it detects a doorway or a wall, it's going to reverse. Or if you're, say, have a bank robot that, you wanted to open its vault to deposit something when a hand is near, works very well in that regard. So all sensors more or less kind of work in a similar way, or theoretical way, in that they're all kind of emitting something and then waiting for it to, come back, or they're waiting for something to come into that system in order for the processing to happen. But again, all of that kind of happens within the component. It's up to us as the programmer to decipher, interpret, and utilize that information the way that we want. So that's kind of maybe a lot to take in, but it's a lot of really fun stuff to take in my opinion. To prove that it's fun to all of you guys, I want to introduce you guys to one of our awesome TAP teachers, who is Brian Wetzel, who is joining us on the call. Brian has a ton of experience. You'll see 18 years of teaching experience, particularly working with robotics. And he is an actual cyborg as well. This is a real picture. But Brian, are you with us? You hanging out?
Can you hear me?
Great. So Brian, right. I'll turn it over to you. Yeah, take it away. Tell me when you want me to change the slide.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for this opportunity to share my experiences. I've really had a lot of fun over the last couple of years doing more with robotics, and we're growing more with what we can do with them all the time in my classes. And with these sensors, like Rusty said, is where it all begins. It's cool to watch the robots walk around, and it's cool to see what they're capable to walk around, drive around. But when they really start interacting with their environment, I think that's really what kind of piques the students' interest a little bit more than anything else, because they're ultimately, they get an expectation and in their head that it's going to do this. And when that sensor does or doesn't pick up like they think it will, they immediately start getting a little bit more curious as to why. And then that's when the technology can come in and really kind of spur them to figure out why exactly they're not getting the reads that they want. So like Rusty said, I've been working with them for several years. I am in Centerburg, Ohio, in the United States. So I work primarily with high school students. In the past couple of years, I've been working with middle school students as well. So that's been a newer experience in my STEM curriculum, but ultimately a welcome one too, because the quicker they start learning about this stuff and the quicker they start developing these habits and these processes, right, the quicker that they can start applying them to other environments and other problem solving, processes in their lives. So go ahead, next slide. Okay, so when I talk about how the students are getting engaged with the robots and the sensors, I like to see all of the possibilities, just all of the doors start to open and all the possibilities of what their robots can be kind of come to fruition. And I see four big things more than anything else that these sensors bring to our robotics curriculum. And first and foremost, it's their creativity. When the sensors get introduced, they start thinking of creative ways to connect them. They start thinking of creative ways to set up obstacles, to program their robot to interpret the data that Rusty was talking about earlier. Everything about the coding and the mechanical nature of it becomes just a creative exploration. I'll talk about this particular robot in a lot of detail here in just a little bit, and others like it. But ultimately, the student that built this completely from the ground up. He didn't follow any kind of building instructions or anything. This was just all a creative sprouting from an open-ended problem that I posed to them. And like I said, we'll talk more about it specifically here in just a second on a future slide. Going on to the next point, the second thing that just comes to light is that iterative problem solving process, because like I said, they attach it and then they code it and then they test it, and inevitably in some way, shape, or form it doesn't work, or it doesn't work as good as they would like it to. So they need to go back and tweak a setting or tweak a value, right, to get closer to that expected result. And then they test again. And then sometimes it's a mechanical or design flaw, and they have to go back and tinker with that. And they come back and test. And then they see that every time they change something, that something else needs tweaked a little bit or can be tweaked just a little bit more. So that iterative problem solving nature that they're over and over testing and redesigning. And it's so iterative, and it's so awesome to see them keep trying and persevere and push through it. So thirdly, critical thinking, right? They really have to dig deep. This comes in both aspects too, the robotics, the physical, the mechanical part of it, but also the programming, because, once again, they set up a program that they believe works, but then their logic was slightly off and they don't know exactly where. So we have to sit down and talk through the process and think about why that particular result is not being achieved. And then kind of closely related to that, but ultimately very different, is they have to think about their environment. As once again, we'll mention in a little bit more detail here in a little bit, we have the grayscale sensor. And it's so temperamental, and that's why it's so complex, as Rusty alluded to. Any changes to the environment or any changes to that particular sensor from day to day, and keep in mind the students can only work with them for 50 minutes if you're lucky at a time in one class period. So anything can happen in the following 23 hours that might change the environment. I might have the double light switches on that makes it a little bit brighter. the path that you'll see later could be scuffed up by students. The different angles, the way the light's hitting, because it's in one spot. Any changes to the environment with some of these sensors will cause drastic changes to their expected outcomes. So it really gets them to think about how similar is my environment compared to it was yesterday. What adjustments do I need to make? And maybe it's just, okay, well, I'm going to flip one of the light switches off to get that slightly dimmer environment like we had yesterday. I'm going to remark the track to get something the way it was previously. So it's all about, like I said, these four things that come to light when they're interacting with these sensors, and presenting these problems. They just have to persevere through and look for creative ways to test and retest, to make changes, to find bugs, right, and then ultimately mimic their environment, where they had some success the previous day, but now they're not getting any. So it's a constant problem-solving process, and that's what makes it so awesome. So I believe
that, Brian, and that's like what just echoes interactions with the engineering design process. It's like practical examples of like really going through that process with students. So I love that.
Absolutely. So as Rusty scrolls through these next slides, I have a handful of videos that will demonstrate how my students have interacted with the sensors. As he plays this one was set up to mimic that real life environment of a parking lot gauge, right? The tank track uses that IR sensor to detect when something's in front of it, and it just keeps moving forward if nothing's in front of it. But as soon as something does, right, as soon as it gets to that gate, it comes to a complete stop because it knows it can't go. The gate, on the other hand, right, it's going to remain closed until it has the need to open. So it's programmed to, once again, utilize that IR sensor that you can see towards the closer to the gate. As soon as something's in front of it, it recognizes the need to open and stay open for a certain amount of time, giving it enough time for the car to pass through. So this was two different students building two different robots that have to work together. Otherwise, there's going to be issues, right? Gates are going to get broken, cars are going to get damaged. And this is, a real life possibility that, these students are definitely going to interact with someday. So if we can.
Yeah, Brian, I love that. Just to kind of echo on some of those points or build up on some of those points. I love this idea of two students having to work together for something that, is a, real life, or even like could be, equated to a life and death situation. A car can't run into,
Absolutely,
a parking gate. So,
as you say, we see these types of gates all the time. It's not just parking garage, right? It might be because the bridge is up.
Right.
So yeah, it definitely can be life or death situation if these sensors aren't working properly.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, when these students were working together, did they work together, or was it kind of a trial and error? What was the approach of the students to get it to work?
For this particular class, this particular year, Centerburg is a very, very small rural school smack dab in the middle of Ohio. And, I just don't have the student population to have huge classes. In this particular case, it was even more that way than normal because this was literally a class of 2 students. So, throughout the year, they were working hand in hand. It was my AP Computer Science Principles class. And we had some time towards the end of the year after the AP test what was completed, and we'd work through our curriculum. What do I do with a little bit more of the time? So they were literally working side by side with each other, so they knew what each other was doing. But still, in the same sense, they had to come up with their own programs for their particular robot, right? Keeping in mind what the objective for each other was. So, did they work together? No, not really, but they definitely did test together. They were with each other, kind of working parallel with each other, and coming to a testing point eventually. So
That's great. That's great, Brian. Okay.
Okay, excuse me. You can see in this particular set of images, right? One being the robot that I was referencing earlier. What's nice about these is these were all a part of the same lesson. And once again, you can just see the creativity coming out because they're all completely different. To an extent, they all cover the same features. The idea behind the lesson, and once again, pulling in that real world, possibly life or death situation. And it is definitely based on one of the worst natural disasters in our country's history. It kind of opens up the lesson. But each of these are what's called a tide gauge. And the idea was, how can we detect flood levels and make sure people are alerted in time, so they can either make a choice to, tough it out, or do they really need to be at a point where they need to evacuate? So it was, and the name of the city is escaping me right now. Put it in the chat, and I'll say it out loud. Can't remember, but a huge flood, all right, in Pennsylvania, where the citizens of the town were not warned in time. It was in the late 1800s. So the lessons and the activities that follow are all about, well, how can we send out a message or signals or something, right, when there is imminent danger, so that any kind of stakeholder to that situation is properly notified. So each of these robots, in their own way, will detect a water level, and then, right, when it gets up to a certain point, it will alert the community in some way, shape, or form, right, around it, whoever can read, whether it's like the National Weather Service or whatever the case may be, right? They can take a reading and take appropriate action before it's too late. Each of these, right, utilizes the ultrasonic sensor, which once again is detecting a distance from a certain object or certain something, and then it sends out those ultrasonic sound waves, right? Returns to the sensor and receives it, and then calculates the distance based off of how long it took to get there and back. So once that water level reaches a certain level, right, each of them incorporate the LEDs to light up according to how dangerous the situation is. And then, as you'll see in a future video, they, we actually did throw some water and put some rising water levels in there, right? And you'll get just a quick example of how, once again, the robot itself utilizes that distance in order to take an appropriate action. So once again, that iterative process, how do we, get our distances, right, run a check of some sort and send signals to different places in a creative, they had the choice to follow some build instructions, but each one of the students in this particular class, and this was a class of 5 different students, they all took their own approach. They all wanted to build their own instead of follow some pre-written instructions. So, like I said, we'll see some examples here in a second.
Brian, can I ask, did the students draw out their designs first, or did they just kind of start building with the pieces and figured out that way?
I always recommend a little bit of sketching. I'm not super huge on it, right? Because I like the students to kind of carve their own path. So in this particular case, I don't think any of these 3 examples, and I can't remember off the top of my head the other 2 that didn't fit on the slide, whether they decided to sketch it or not. But I always think that's a good brainstorming step. But I've also found they just like to take off. They love to get their hands dirty. They love to build. Like I said, they don't want to stare at a screen, um, following someone else's ideas. They want to be creative. So I think for many students, especially these days, their best tinkering method and their best design process is just to start building and see what happens and tweak it as necessary.
Yeah, I love that approach, and I agree with you there. Because it's kind of funny to say, be really creative, but be creative within this rigid structure. Draw it out first, or
Yeah.
like maybe the parameters are just the objective, and letting the students just take it. I think is such a cool and successful approach, especially just inspiring that creativity.
I think they're much more proud of their own creations, right? Whether they're drawn or whether they're, just or not. I think they take more ownership of it because they know it's theirs. They know it's their responsibility, their creation from the ground up. Which anytime they're taking more ownership over something, they're going to be more engaged. They're going to be more, uh, fixed on the process and more inclined to achieve the defined success parameters, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. The advance.
So if you haven't noticed, all of these particular robots were built with the UKIT Advanced. I think those are definitely a little bit more appropriate for high school students, right? But actually, the pair of hands and the student in the background, when we did these activities last school year, they were both 8th graders. So I think as a teacher, you know your students and what they're capable of. And these two students, definitely have that aspiration of looking into computers and what computers are capable of, want to explore, and they created some awesome things last semester, the spring semester of last school year. Like I said, this particular student was not one of the ones in the pictures previously, but he had one of the coolest kind of tweaks to his robot. When this video is played, you'll see that he just uses his hand as kind of like that water level, right? But the infrared sensor is pointing straight down. When his hand's under it at that quote unquote unsafe level, right, you get the warning red light. But then he also enabled it to kind of point. So once again, this is to mimic tide gauges, all right, measuring water levels. He made it so that the sensor can actually point out like it's checking a different area, maybe downstream, or some other lake, or I mean, I guess the possibilities, the simulations are endless, but he wanted to give it the freedom to do more than just point straight down. And he took off with it, and we did a lot of tinkering just to get that mechanism working, with an up and down arrow press to make it look at different spots. And that just opens the world up to so many other things, because now you're looking at trigonometric relationships possibly to get proper readings. And once again, the student's an 8th grader and as gifted as he is, I'm not sure he was ready for trigonometric functions yet. So we just kind of left it as is, but still it took a lot of tinkering to figure out testing iterations to get all of this working as you're seeing right there.
And just looking at this, I love how kind of simplistic the build is, because I can tell the focus here is getting that ultrasonic sensor to leverage and operate the warning signals. I feel like the emphasis and the time was spent on other applications than kind of the overall structure, which I think is a really cool approach. It's
Absolutely.
and it is why it's also aligned with the theme of interacting with sensors and focusing on sensors, because the main source of energy was geared towards getting those sensors to operate in the right way, which the student achieved, on a high level. So it's a cool take, I think it's a cool different take from, some of our more standardized robots that students would build.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that, in the real world, this is likely how many of these projects and products get started. They
Yeah.
don't create the finished product that's all nice and pretty and simplistic, and they get the insides and the guts working first and doing what they need to do, and then they focus on making it look the way people like things to look. So
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that mimics the real world as much or more than anything.
Yeah, I love that connection. That's spot on. I like that.
So here's the next one, and once again, this is the big tall one. One of our questions before you go ahead and play it. Once again, you're going to see me come in here. I'm going to start to fill up that bucket with water. We were unsure if the sensor would sense water. And some of my students were asking that too, like, will it see rising water? So one thing that this student did, so that we didn't have to answer that question, is he built like a little raft of sorts with some extra parts that floated up with the water level. So it definitely had something hard to reach off of. So you can see right there, the water level's rising and the LED lit up a little bit. Say, hey, this might be something to start paying attention to. And then as it gets to a quote unquote unsafe level, right, not only does it turn red, but it starts to turn in different directions back and forth to kind of send out that signal to different people that might be able to see it, or might be sitting in different spots. So he incorporated a couple of different ways to just warn, right? Once again, based on that water level. And as it turns out, part of our experimentations, it does sense water levels just fine. You don't need the little raft right there, but it was a consideration to make that he integrated pretty easily, just with a few extra parts. So once again, that iterative process and just testing different factors was just an awesome unit.
And Brian, is that just a lucky guess that it activates the red light, the warning, right at the very top of the water level?
Well, that took measurements.
That is so accurate.
Yeah, we took measurements. We knew, and I can't remember what they were off the top of my head, but we knew that where the top of how deep the bucket was. I think in a couple of tests I had to make sure I had to go get enough water, all right, to fill the bucket. But they all gauged the danger level just a little bit differently too. So their numbers were kind of all over the place in terms of what's warning, what's imminent danger. So yeah, like I said, in this case, he programmed it to be imminent danger right there when that distance to that object was right at the top, which maybe they should be warned a little bit sooner than that. But if I remember right, that was part of the reflection discussions. So.
And Brian, just on the side, how was the cleanup process? Were any big spills or anything?
There's a couple.
Yeah, of course.
But one of the parameters too was to make sure that the robotics, the innards, were in no danger. So this part was all on me, making sure that I didn't get too crazy with that bucket. But after the robot was in there, it was easy to just pull it out, put it on a towel and wipe the plastic pieces off. But yeah, transferring the bin back to the bucket for the next test, that was a trick and a half.
Yeah,
that included a couple of mops.
Wow.
So here's my last example, and we spent a lot of time on this simply because, as it was alluded to earlier, this grayscale sensor is definitely the most complex, which means it's the most temperamental. So this video is a little bit long, not 100% sure how long, if we'll get through it all. But once again, the grayscale sensor senses light and dark colors. It doesn't really do much more than that, but it's able to do it in 5 different areas of that grayscale sensor. So as he said, it's commonly used for line following, and that robot is recognizing whether or not one of those 5 sensors built into the board is actually reading that dark electric, black electric tape, right, that I just did a makeshift course on. And the challenge of this particular activity was to not only just follow the line, but see who could navigate the course the quickest. So, the students were making their own, robots once again to, that incorporated the grayscale sensor in some way, shape, or form. And then they had to program it to follow that line. And in order to prevent them from just programming right turns at certain points, I programmed in a left turn right there. You just saw it pass by. But each time most of the programs kind of followed the idea that when the one sensor was over top of it, it would just keep driving forward, right? But if it got off track a little bit, then one of the other 2 sensors would steer it back to a point where the original sensor, the one in the middle, actually picks it up and it starts driving forward again. So they, all of them just kind of tweaked and tinkered. I put objects in their way. This lesson in and of itself was, just making the lesson was part of the, you could say engineering design, simply because, looking at it, I think I made the course a little bit too big. I made some of the obstacles and some of the ways to score. I think I had a little bit too high expectations. So if and when I do this lesson again, I'm going to just tinker with the parameters a little bit so that there'd be a little bit more opportunity for success. But anyway, they were all, kind of on board with trying to get it to stay on course. But like I said, whenever light changes, some of them calibration changes. That was something. Does it read the gray tile? Like you can see how the tiling in my classroom is, and some of them are more white tiles, some of them more gray tiles, but the black electric tape stays the same. So does it read the gray tiles as light? Does it read them as dark? And that takes, a lot of calibration. So not only did they test over and over and over again, but they did a lot of different calibrations for, how do the gray tiles affect the course and the path? How does the white versus the white tiles? Like I said, this was just electric tape, and I have, 120 students throughout the day walking all over it. So there's dirty scuff marks. There's bunched up areas where it was accidentally kicked and slid. At some points, towards the end, parts were getting stretched and ripped. So, every single day we had to come in and just make adjustments because the environment wasn't the same anymore. So for this particular video, we just threw a GoPro on the robot and let it go. So, but yeah, this was fun. It was very frustrating, right, at times. There's no denying that. But once again, when things are frustrating, it just teaches us to persevere and push through. Critically think about what adjustments need to be made.
I love this video, Brian. And yeah, I can speak to that. Working with the grayscale, it's not the easiest component to work with. It can be pretty complicated. And the main complication, just as Brian said, is the environmental factors. If you're just this one image is a good example of that. You have a darker tile right next to a lighter tile. So maybe one of those sensors, is programmed a little bit differently than the other sensor. So it's reading maybe this as a, in between dark and light versus another sensor is reading it as dark. There's a lot of factors to consider. So it's definitely what I would say more an upper level component to work with. But this video is proof that it works well when you work it out.
And like I said, that's a lot in the calibration too. That's fun to mess around with, simply because a couple of the students at least got to a point where they calibrated the light aspect of the sensor to the darker tiles. Wow. So if it was over top a lighter tile, it would be even lighter and definitely read as a light color. Whereas the black electric tape was a consistent black kind of frame of reference in that calibration process.
Oh, that's an interesting approach. Yeah, like using the darker tile as the light calibration. I like that. Yeah.
Another thing that was frustrating for them on this one, and this was more of a mechanical thing, was how much light is getting underneath, because it has to be set on the bottom of the robot or line following car. So some of them were kind of putting it on there loosely, and then the angle would be slightly different, which means the sensors are slightly higher. All of these changes just make it a very inconsistent and frustrating sensor to work with. But and that's not a bad thing, because it opens the door to so many good discussions. And once again, iterative natures to make sure that we're replicating things the way that we've been testing. So
I love it. You're definitely an engineering teacher, Brian.
I try.
Great. So I think that's it for Brian, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
So
the
big
one
round
last
of applause first before you say anything, Brian. Yeah, thank you so much. So big round of applause for you. I really appreciate you jumping on the call with us today.
No problem. Anytime. The one thing that I did forget to put on there was my contact information. So I'll go ahead and put that in the chat, and anyone following along can reach out, send me an email, and I will respond as quickly as my hectic, ever so crazy schedule allows me to.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, we really appreciate working with you. There's a lot that we can learn from you. So I love it. So thanks for taking the time once again. So
No
excellent. So we are going to ask if you guys have any questions in a moment. But prior to that, a little bit of UB Tech Education self-promotion. As a reminder, we do have a free training portal where we do have all of our curriculum resources and tips on working a lot of the sensors. So we have different, sensor lessons within our courses. So if you're interested in, how to work with the grayscale sensor or some of the other sensors, you can always check out our resources on the portal. So please visit this URL. You can also find it on our website. Don't worry about grabbing a pen right now or your phone or whatnot. We have it linked out on our website as well. So just a reminder to look at some of our courses. So excellent. So now's our time. If you guys have any questions, you can always drop them in the chat for us. We love questions. So, feel free to ask away. If you're compiling and typing right now, feel free to do so. I'll move on to the last slide, just to remind you guys that we will have another webinar next month, which will be part 2 of our sensor series. We are going to look a little bit more in depth at the UKIT Advanced, as in particular looking at our browser-based programming environment, UCode. So that is October 18th at 3 p.m. Pacific time. So if you'd like to sign up, we'd love to have you. So please do so.
All right. If you have any questions, you're welcome to hang out and put them in the chat. If you don't have any questions, we hope to see you next month at next month's webinar, and we enjoyed having you all. And thanks again to Brian for presenting with us and joining. And he's created some great resources that we will make sure we get up and share with you guys as well around the grayscale sensor.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate. This was a fun one. This was a good one. So thanks again, Brian. Thanks for all those that joined. And yeah, hope to see everyone next month.
Have a good night, guys.